Welcome back to the Constitutional Clarion. Today I'm going to talk to you about the Chair of St Edward, which is the Coronation Chair, and the Stone of Scone, which sits under that chair. Both of them have quite an interesting history. Now, the Stone of Scone is the oldest, of course, and its history has been suffused with myth. Going back to the Old Testament, it's been claimed that the Stone of Scone is actually the rather uncomfortable pillow that Jacob used when he dreamt of angels climbing a ladder into heaven. It's then been claimed that this stone was taken from Israel, taken to Egypt, and from Egypt, Pharaoh's daughter took it to Spain, and after Spain, it travelled to Ireland, where Irish kings at Tara were crowned, sitting on this particular stone. And it's been claimed that the stone would groan if you were the true king, and it would remain silent if you were a pretender. And from there, apparently, the stone was taken to Scotland, where it ended up in a monastery at Scone and was used for the inauguration of various Scottish monarchs. In fact, when they've studied the stone, they discovered that its makeup suggested that it was actually quarried from not far out of Scone. It seems that its various peregrinations around the world are probably all just myth, but we do know that the stone was used for the inauguration of various Scottish monarchs, the last one being John Balliol in 1292. So what happened after that? Well, Edward I of England, in a battle against Scotland, was successful, and as spoil of war, he took the regalia of the Scots, so their crowns and symbols of sovereignty, and then went quite out of his way to go to Scone to take the Stone of Scone, to bring it back to London, where he placed it in Westminster Abbey and commissioned a chair to be made so that he could sit on that stone that symbolised Scottish sovereignty and showed his own victory over that sovereignty. Now, originally he commissioned a chair that was made of bronze. And we've got the receipts that show the invoice for the progress of the making of that chair, but they abandoned it in August of 1297. And it's been speculated that the reason was simply that a chair made of bronze would have been very heavy, and if you put an extremely heavy stone in it, this stone weighs about 125 kilos, it would be impossible to move the chair, and moreover it would cause serious damage to the magnificent Cosmati pavement that had recently been installed in Westminster Abbey. And as a consequence of that, it seems they decided to revert to a wooden chair, which instead would be gilded and made beautiful to look like it was made of gold. So this particular chair had all sorts of decorations on it. We know from tiny bits that are left that there were birds and vines on it. There also seems to have been a depiction of Edward the Confessor with a lion under his feet. We know that there were other depictions of kings on the back of the chair, of a knight on horseback, and of an old mythological green man. They also made the chair in a quite clever way, and this was again to deal with the problem of moving it. So they made it in parts. So there was a base, and then you'd put the stone in the base, and then the rest of the chair slotted in on top. So you could remove the top of the chair, take out the stone, move the base, and use those three parts as you move to make it much easier for it to be placed elsewhere. So that's the making of the chair, but what again of the stone? Well, the stone remained very significant to the Scots, and the victory of Edward I was not long lasting. So Robert the Bruce, in battles for Scotland against the British, was successful. And when there was a negotiation of a peace treaty with Edward II of England, one of the claims Robert the Bruce made was for the return of the Stone of Scone. And Edward II refused that because he thought it would be an insult to his father, who had indeed taken the stone. But not long after, his own successor, Edward III, who was a young 15-year-old monarch, did want to use the stone, this time as a bargaining chip in negotiating a treaty with the Scots. And the idea was to take the stone up towards the borders and use it as a way of getting better terms in that negotiated treaty. So he ordered the Abbot of Westminster Abbey to provide the stone, and the Abbot refused. Moreover, the Abbot ensured that those iron rings were placed in the bottom of the stone, and they're not for carrying the stone, they were for chaining the stone to the floor of Westminster Abbey so the king couldn't take it away. Moreover, he managed to whip up the crowds so that there were rioting crowds outside Westminster Abbey to try and prevent the stone from being removed. And so the stone stayed in Westminster Abbey. Now, the chair itself was used for coronations. We're not absolutely sure whether it was initially used for those coronations from 1300 onwards, but certainly we've got evidence that from 1399 it's been used in all the coronations, and that was for 26 different monarchs. The construction of the chair has changed over time. Originally there was no seat, it was added later. Earlier on, the monarch would actually sit on the stone, although probably on a cushion above the stone because it would be rather uncomfortable otherwise. And those prominent lions on the feet of the chair, they were added as well around 1727. The chair itself became a bit tatty over time. Unfortunately, some schoolboys from the Westminster School did tend to get out their penknives when bored and add a little bit of graffiti to the chair. So you can see that one P. Abbot, perhaps an ancestor of Tony, who knows, managed to carve into the chair that on the night of 5th to 6th of July in 1800, he slept in the chair. Other people would take slithers of the chair as some kind of a souvenir to keep. Bits of enamel were taken off it as well. And some of the worst damage to the chair was done through repair or alleged repair of the chair. So for Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee, some genius decided it would be good to cover it all with brown goopy varnish. And they did that, and there were complaints raised in Parliament about it. And when it was raised in Parliament, the government said, oh no, we haven't damaged the chair. But what we will do is we will remove all the varnish, no problem, it'll be absolutely fine. So then they got methylated spirits, and the tradesmen used their aprons and the methylated spirits to rub off the brown goop that they'd put on it, and in doing so took off an awful lot of what was left of the gold gilding, making a complete and utter mess of it. Now, there have been various threats to the chair over time. The first, of course, was from Henry VIII and the dissolution of the monasteries between 1536 and 1540. So in many cases, the monasteries were destroyed or their riches were taken by the monarch. But in this particular case, because the abbey was a place where kings were crowned and kings were buried, Henry VIII had a lot more respect for it, so the coronation chair survived. Greater peril occurred, however, when the monarchy fell, when Charles I was executed, because that was when a republic was brought in, and the new republicans wanted to destroy all the symbols of monarchy, and that included the regalia. So all the crowns and sceptres and various bits of regalia were all melted down and the metal used for other things or sold off. The only thing that survived was one tiny little spoon that's used in the coronation. The chair, however, and the Stone of Scone did survive, and they were actually put to a different use. So rather than crowning a monarch, we discover that Oliver Cromwell himself was installed as Lord Protector on this chair with the stone, but having moved them out of the Abbey and into Westminster Hall across next to the Parliament. The next attack on the stone occurred in June 1914. Now this was before World War I, and the attackers were suffragettes. They were enraged that the king had refused to meet a deputation of the suffragettes. So what did they do? They hung a bomb in a bag on one of the pinnacles of the coronation chair. They filled the bomb with nuts and bolts to do serious damage, and then let it explode there while there were people in the abbey. If anyone had been nearby, they could have been killed or seriously injured. So it was a pretty dreadful thing to do. As it happened, nobody was injured. There was apparently a deafening bang and an inordinate amount of smoke. People were very frightened and ran out of the abbey. But that it did do quite significant damage to the chair. So the pinnacle that it was hung around was blown off. Part of the chair was blackened, and there were deep gashes in the chair as well. And leaving their calling card there as a symbol, they had left a feather boa that apparently the bomb had been hidden in, along with a woman's silk purse and a guidebook nearby. During World War I, there was a concern that you wouldn't just have suffragettes doing the bombing, but there would be bombing from the enemy, and therefore the chair and the stone were taken down to a crypt underneath Westminster Abbey to protect them. But the real concern came during World War II, and that was that the Nazis would invade Britain and seek to install a puppet king. And they had their puppet king in mind, and that was Edward VIII, who had previously abdicated because he wanted to marry Wallis Simpson. Wallis Simpson was seen to be very close to the Nazis, and Edward himself somewhat sympathetic towards them, and it was assumed that if the Nazis did invade and take over, that they would seek to legitimise Edward VIII by having him crowned on the Coronation Chair with the Stone of Scone. So what the British did was they separated the two. They buried the stone underneath one of the chapels in Westminster Abbey, and they took the coronation chair and boxed it up and placed it in a crypt in Gloucester Cathedral behind a sarcophagi, somewhere where it would never be found. And in both cases, there were only a very small number of people who knew where it was, but there was a concern that if all of them were killed in the fighting when the Nazis invaded, that no one would ever be able to find these really important historical items again. And so they gave a plan saying where they were to the Canadian High Commissioner, and it was sent to the Canadian Prime Minister and the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario, and each of those put this important information in a bank vault just in case it was needed later on after Nazis had been defeated and expelled from the United Kingdom. Finally, in 1950, there was the theft of the stone. So some students who were nationalists from Scotland came and broke into the Abbey at night and pulled the stone from the chair, damaging the chair. So they broke the grille on front of it and damaged part of the seat. They pulled the stone out, and when it dropped, it broke into two pieces, and they eventually took the stone back to Scotland. After some months of controversy, apparently one policeman said, yes, we're looking for the people who stole the stone, but not so hard as to find them. The students eventually surrendered the stone, leaving it on the altar of another abbey in Scotland, and it was then returned to London. Now, there is a story that it actually wasn't the real stone that was returned. It was a replica stone that another stonemason had made for a previous attempt at stealing the Stone of Scone. Apparently, you can go and see it in a pub in Glasgow if you're inclined, although I suspect that that's probably not the case. I suspect the real one was actually returned. Finally, on the 700th anniversary of the taking of the Stone of Scone from Scotland, the British government decided to return it to Scotland, and to do so, however, with legal conditions attached to it. So there are special commissioners who have a legal role as guardians to protect the stone, and as part of that, a condition of returning it to London, to Westminster Abbey, for any coronation. And that is indeed what's happened. The stone has very recently returned to Westminster Abbey for the coronation of King Charles III. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.